as we go through the fourth chapter of Ketubot, we're transitioning from discussion about what point or at what point does a woman or a girl move from the domain of her father to the domain of her husband. And then we go on to the real subject of the ketubah. In other words, what responsibilities does the husband take on when he writes the ketubah? But you remember, when we were discussing the status of a daughter who's kind of below the age of majority, one of the things that we learned was that the father doesn't, strictly speaking, in halakha, have an obligation to maintain her, to support her. And the Talmud had a big problem with this and eventually came back and said, look, he absolutely did until the age of 6. And even after the age of 6, the judges should basically embarrass him to the point that he would support her. But the point is that it remains an issue. And this question of support will now come back as we look at the obligations of a husband towards his wife, because support is actually one of the key obligations. Maintenance is one of the key obligations which is assumed by the ketubah. But before we get on to support, actually we're going to get on to ransom. Lo chatavla de'im tishtivayin efrekanich. If he didn't write for her, that means write for her in the ketubah. If you're taken captive, I will ransom you. Va atevinich li leintu, and I'll take you back again as my wife. And you can hear I'm having trouble just sight reading these because we're not in Hebrew anymore. This is Aramaic. This is colloquial. This is Palestinian Aramaic. And we're actually in the words of the ketubah. And by the way, these words are not in today's ketubah. So all of the sayings, by the way, in this half of chapter 4 of Ketubot, which talk about stuff in the ketubah, none of these are in today's ketubah. Maybe because it's assumed, it's assumed it's their obligations anyway. Well, we'll find out. Because if he didn't write, if you're taken captive and I'll ransom you and take you again as my wife, or for kohenet, and in the case of a priest's wife, ach zerini li benidatich, I will restore you to your country or your people. Chayav, he's obligated. He has to do these things for her. He has to ransom her. He has to take her back as his wife. In the case of a priest's wife, remember we've learned the halacha that a woman who is taken captive is assumed to have been raped, and a priest can't marry someone who's been raped. So I think the assumption is he sort of restores her back to her father's house. I think that's the assumption. Chayav shehu t'nai beit din, because it's a condition laid down by the court. In other words, just by missing these obligations from the ketubah doesn't mean that he doesn't take on these obligations. And similarly, and the Mishnah is going to just draw this out a bit. Nishbeit chayav liftota. If she's taken captive, he's obligated to ransom. Amar harei kitavik uktuvata tifte et atzma a norashai. If he said, look, she can have her get and she can have her ketubah. In other words, I'm going to divorce her straight away. And she can go and ransom herself. I.e., he's going to divorce his wife now that she's been taken captive. He's not permitted. And the commentators draw out the fact that he's obligated to ransom her as soon as she's taken captive. In other words, that obligation to ransom is over and above any obligation he has to pay her ketubah. So fine, he can divorce her. And if he divorces her, he has to give her her ketubah. But he has to ransom her as well, because the obligation to ransom her is an obligation that is created during the marriage, and it's quite independent of the ketubah. So he has to ransom her. But there's always a but. In every Mishnah, there's always a but. And these Mishnayot all draw out boundary cases. What if she's injured? What if she, and the Mishnah says lakat. I mean, lakat means struck, but it means here, struck by something, maybe struck by a runaway ox or struck by disease. She's injured in some way, lakat. Well, the context is obvious from the end of the Mishnah. Lakat chayav l'rapota. If she's injured, he's obliged to heal her. And that is, healing is considered part of maintenance. So it's assumed that he has an obligation to support her and maintain her from the ketubah. So that includes her medical expenses. Absolutely includes her medical expenses. In other words, he doesn't need to heal her physically himself, but he has to arrange for her to be healed. But, and here's the but, Amar, harei gita uktuvata terape et atzma. If he said, here's her get and here's her ketubah, let her heal herself, he is permitted. Because the assumption of the halacha is that the obligation to maintain actually stops when she's divorced. He's not obliged to maintain his wife after divorce. And we've said that healing is part of maintenance. So while it seems quite invidious to us, although I was not able to find any protest in the commentators, by the way, but while it seems invidious to us, the halakha will allow him to divorce a wife who's ill and then cease supporting her on the grounds that her ketubah and her ketubah now pays for her ongoing support. Now, the ability to kind of sort of, if you like, let go doesn't extend to his own death. So this series of Mishnayot now goes on to dealing with life after death. Lo chatavla. And we're going to shift back into Aramaic. If he didn't write for her, binin, dichrin, dihevon lich, minai, Diyarsun yat ksaf ktubatich yoter al chulkohon diim achehun chayav shehu t'nai beddin. If he didn't write for her, the male children that are going to be born to you from me, in other words, the male children from the marriage, shall inherit the money of your ketubah over and above their shares with their brothers. So we're thinking now about a man with two wives, and maybe the two wives have two different ketubot. And maybe, by the way, there are different numbers of children born to each wife. So the financial division could be quite complex, but the principle is that each bunch of children or each bunch of sons inherits their mother's ketubah. So if there are two bunches of sons, one lot would inherit one mother's ketubah and the other lot would inherit the other mother's ketubah. And it might be more, one bunch of sons might get more than the other. And then any remaining part of the estate, in other words, anything that comes directly from the father, that is going to be split equally. And we'll see that the conditions for daughters are slightly different. We'll look at that in the next few Mishnayot. But as far as the boys are concerned, each one inherits the ketubah of their mother, because that's a condition of the court. And you can see, by the way, why the rabbis instituted this, because when they're handing over, when parents are handing over money, are setting aside money for the ketubah for their daughter, you can see that they want to be incentivized to set aside a generous portion. And they don't want to run the risk that money they set aside for their daughter might be inherited by another woman's sons, perhaps after her death and the death of her husband. So you can see why the rabbis set this up. There's an assumption, and I guess there's a fundamental assumption that parents are going to be putting money into the ketubah of their daughter, and they want to make sure that that money is safe.